Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. And today I have with me Professor Mukesh Anand of the NIPFP. And we'll discuss the whole issue of pensions. As many of you know, the old pension scheme and the new pension scheme has been creating a lot of debate. There's been question marks about why Congress party, which actually dumped the old pension scheme in the first place, is trying to revive it. Why is it trying to go away from the new pension scheme and restart old pension scheme? It has been argued that the old pension scheme is financially ruinous for the government, and that many states will suffer as a result. Yet at the same time, there are some question marks about the new pension scheme, in particular whether it treats the new employees of the government just on the equal footing as it treated the old employees, and so there is some doubt in that also. So where does where does the truth lie? And also, uh, this old pension and new pension scheme is largely about government employees, but the fact is that people who do not work in the government, and there's a very small sliver of people who actually work for the government, uh, everybody else gets old, needs pension, and then there is a broader question mark about whether India's pension system are good enough for everybody. So today we have an expert who has studied this topic, and Professor Anand has written a lot on this. In particular, I wrote a recent piece on a working paper that Professor Anand has written in the past. And I would like to first of all welcome Professor Anand for joining us on the show. Thank you. And let's kickstart with the basics first. What is this OPS scheme that everybody is talking about, and why was it dropped to begin with?
The OPS scheme, which is the old pension scheme, was a way of administering the pensions for the public sector employees largely. We are concentrating only on the public sector employees here, which covers government employees and some institutions like universities and things like that. So in this scheme, it was based on a defined benefit system, which means when you start your career, that at that time itself, you know what kind of benefit you are going to derive once you retire from the system. And the benefits were clearly linked to your current compensation and the number of years of service which you put in. So it was called eligible pay and qualifying services. Okay. So and if you have qualifying service of about 33 years, you would get a full pension, which would be based on an average of the basic pay and dearness allowance in the last 10 months. 50% of that you will get as a monthly pension for the rest of your life. And this monthly pension, recurring pension, is actually fully indexed to the price level as well as the wage level. So it means it is 100% wage and inflation indexed. That is one part. This is the recurring part of the benefit, which was defined. There is another part, which is the one time or terminal benefit, which you can avail of at the time of retirement. This includes mainly three components. You'll get a gratuity, which is a good thing. In the a gratuity, there is a rate at which you get it, and there is a ceiling on it also. And then you can encash your unavailed leaves. Up to 300 leaves which you can accumulate can be now encashed at the end of your service life, and the rate at which you will encash them is again the peak rate of your earnings. And then finally you can commute up to 40% of your pension entitlement, monthly pension entitlement, which will be restored when I say you can commute, which means 40% of the current rate of monthly pension for the rest of your life, what you were to get, that you can get as a lump sum together today when you retire from service. It almost amounts to more than 2.5 years of your final compensation in the form of basic pay and dearness allowance. And the leaves can also be translated into almost a year's worth of basic pay and dearness allowance at the end of your service. That is the lump sum you will get. And the commutation, you don't stop there. Actually, the commutation can be restored if you have survived more than 15 years in your retirement. That's not all. If you reach the age 80, the replacement rate, which I said was 50% of your last drawn pay, average of the last drawn pay, that is raised to 60%. And every 5 years, 5 more years that you survive, it is raised by another 10% to reach 100% of your last drawn pay, fully wage and inflation indexed when you reach the age 100. So that is the defined benefit old pension scheme.
Okay.
Against this, you now pitch the new pension scheme.
No, so I want to first ask you something. There's this couplet by Akbar Ilhabadi where he said that हम क्या कहें अहबाब क्या काम कर गए क्या कार्य नुमाया कर गए. What should I tell you, my friend, what I have done? बीए हुए नौकर हुए पेंशन मिली फिर मर गए. So basically this massive achievement that if you could somehow get a government job, and your life is sorted with the kind of benefits that you're talking about.
So you need to just put your foot into the door and your life is sorted.
Exactly. So I would like to understand one thing. The OPS scheme was so good and all the top bureaucrats obviously were involved in it. And so why was it dropped to begin with?
There is no doubt that the expenditure on OPS or the old pension scheme was spiraling. And so there needed to be a way to actually find something to reform the pension system. And so that was the trigger. There is no doubt that the rate of growth of the pension expenditure was almost in more than 20% or so. So it had, in some, for example, in some states, it had reached the level of almost a sixth of its total expenditure. I mean, and competing with the interest payments, kind of. So that is the reason. So which means it squeezes all other form of expenditure, maybe on education or health, which was actually almost unanimously taken up as a priority thing to raise the expenditure, public expenditure on education and health. And if you see, despite political unanimity in that cause, we were never able to raise the expenditure on social sectors like education and health, precisely because there are some elements in the expenditure which were actually going out of control. Okay. And so what they did was to go about with pension reform, which they called the pension scheme.
The new pension scheme. So can you explain what is the new pension scheme then? How was it different from, say, the old pension scheme in that sense?
If you would recall, what I said in the old pension scheme was that it was a completely defined benefit system where the recurring as well as the one-time terminal components all were clearly defined, mostly linked to the peak salary, and were being ratcheted up also for the very old. Now, in the new pension scheme, that certainty or assurance of a guaranteed benefit was significantly diluted. But what was actually made mandatory was that you will have to make a contribution. The earlier scheme was only defined benefit, no contributions to be made by individuals. Only the government is making the final contribution of the pension benefit. In the new scheme, as soon as the employer gets into service, the employee gets into service, he or she also starts making a contribution. And the initial contribution rate which was decided was both the employer and the employee would share 10% each of their future pensions. So the guarantee was done away with, the assurance of a defined benefit was done away with. These monies which will be contributed would be invested into market securities and bonds or whatever, whether government bonds or in the private sector. They would earn a return, possibly managed by expert pension fund managers who would try and get the best returns possible in the market, Indian market, or even outside if it is allowed to be invested. And the pot which will be supposedly growing over the years, that would actually become your pension pot, from where you could draw out a lump sum at the end of your service life, and the rest remainder 60% would be actually invested into into a scheme which will give you an annuity, which means it will give you an annual payout, and which can be converted into a monthly payout.
Okay.
So what one would expect is that this monthly payout would have some kind of a resonance or relationship with the monthly or recurring benefit which people were getting in the old pension scheme.
Okay.
So that's the kind of thing which would have played on the mind of people who were actually trying to sell this new pension scheme, that this is the kind of pot will be quite big, and that it should be able to give you a reasonable or decent monthly pension.
But was that the case? Was there a massive gap, or was the gap actually very little?
It's difficult to say, because I guess there would be, I don't know whether there are known cases of people who have actually come out of the new pension scheme and started getting benefits. That is not there in the PFRDA website, at least I don't get to see that.
Yeah.
But what had increasingly been troubling the new members in the new pension scheme was that perhaps the returns or the rate of growth of the pot was not big enough to be able to provide the kind of defined benefit which people were drawing from the old pension system. Definitely, it would have been insufficient to be fully wage and inflation indexed.
Okay, so
even if you get the nominal amount, it would not have been able to suffice for any kind of wage or inflation indexation.
So it would be correct to say that, the old pension scheme, the argument that it is financially unsustainable is a tenable argument. It's a valid argument.
It is unsustainable because it was growing at a very high rate. So that is clearly an indicator of it being unsustainable. Right. The other things of unsustainability you can get from as far as public expenditure is concerned, it is actually circumscribing a larger share of the expenditure. So you are unable to actually grow the other services which are essential.
True.
So that it is definitely unsustainable.
Okay.
But the root cause of unsustainability is the way the benefits were defined.
Okay. But at the same time, it's also important to understand for viewers that the new pension scheme also had its own pitfalls, in the sense that it was not sort of giving the employees the kind of benefits that they expected while they were applying or were hoping typically in a government job. And that's at the root of some of this pull.
Right. What would see in the extant world of finance, you are willing to give up as long as your expected payoff is reasonable. There is a potential benefit, which is the maximum benefit, and there is a risk associated with that benefit. So when the rate of return starts rising, the risk also starts rising, but you balance your rate of return and risk to be able, and you try to reach an expected level of benefit. So with different people have different levels of risk aversion, and they will choose it. But normally people would start settling down at some reasonable level of expected payoff. Okay. So that expected payoff means the only benchmark which a newcomer would have is that the expected payoff can be anchored to the existing benefit.
Yeah.
Now that, if it is held too high, is a difficult proposition to be served by any kind of a market investment.
True.
So unless you get into a Ponzi scheme, which is going to fail on any sooner or later. So that's the only thing which was it. But given that now the defined benefit system or the defined contributory system, both can be shown to be mathematically equivalent, provided you have a contribution rate which is reasonably high and a rate of return which is reasonably high. You can always match the benefit which is there. But whether that is possible, and when that is not possible, then you have to see whether the benefits themselves are misplaced. And the other thing here would be in the case of the defined benefit system, when it came about, the populations, see, it is a simple mathematical relationship. If the population is growing, which means the number of workers, you can assume that the number of workers are also growing. So at the same tax rate of taxing the workers' income, you will be able to collect more revenues, and you are serving a group of people who are smaller than now. So if the incomes are growing, if the population is growing, you can sustain a defined benefit system, again, provided that you are not letting the benefits be scaled up every time. What we did in India was actually we continued to ratchet up the benefit also. In the current situation, we are reaching a population stabilization stage. Our growth rate is also decelerating, or if it's not negative but decelerating, but population rate is slowing down, although the number of workers is yet growing. But those number of workers are not getting transformed into actual employment. So your income, the potential income generation is not happening. That is another reason why a defined benefit system would fail.
Right.
So the rate of growth of population and the growth of incomes should bear a simple relationship with the rate of interest. That's the simple relationship for any kind of intergenerational transfer, debt or pension. Pension is also an intergenerational transfer. So it's in some sense a debt which with the young are actually paying out.
Okay, so this is very important, because we understood this whole debate about OPS and NPS, and how much of it is unsustainable, or what are the problems with the NPS scheme per se. But one thing that you pointed out in your paper is that this whole scheme about the OPS and NPS actually targets a very small proportion of people in the Indian economy, in the Indian population. Everybody would get old. Everybody would want to have some kind of pension system, and there has to be a method of architecture within the country to service that. Now, and you point out that that is not necessarily the best system that we have in the country. Can you just explain that this OPS NPS debate, how how lopsided, as it were, this whole debate is in terms of the people involved?
Okay, I'm not sure about the numbers which I'm going to say now, but roughly 10 to 12% of the people are actually covered under any form of an old age income support system or a mandatory old age income support system, which would include the private provident fund, employees provident fund, and the Assam Tea Plantation Fund, Coal Mines Provident Fund, and the government.
Okay. So that means 85% you're saying of
workers are not covered under any mandatory scheme.
True.
You can choose to be in a voluntary scheme. It's difficult to say, and when I add up, assuming that all those who are in voluntary schemes they don't overlap with those who are in the mandatory schemes. Like I also have a public provident fund. So I'm saying I'm 2 persons now. Even if I do that, the total coverage does not reach 20% of the population, or the 20% of the workers. Now, what that does is there is so the initial thrust of why pensions came in was there was an observation that old age poverty in old age has a higher incidence than poverty in the younger ages or poverty for the population as a whole.
Mm.
So which means if the incidence of poverty is higher, so to target that, this pensions or to provide for old age income support came in.
Mm. Mm.
And this was then made universal for all the elderly in certain countries, particularly after around the time of the war, after the Second World War. So this became more popular in most of the developed world.
Mm.
Now, but then after, so if you in India, what happened? We continue to exclude a very large number of workers from participating in the mandatory schemes. That is by design.
Mm.
The other is because the average incomes are so low, to expect them to participate in voluntary schemes where they make a contribution
Yeah.
is something which I think is not tenable in a country like ours, because the marginal propensity to consume
True.
still be more than one for a very large, more than 50% of the population, and to expect them to save for something which they'll get say 30 or 40 years down the line is
Yeah.
something I don't think that's going to make any dent in their participation.
Yeah.
So the excluded workers, today's excluded worker will show up as several decades, 2 to 3 or 4 decades down the line, as an excluded or uncovered elderly,
Mm.
or he or she would be covered under some social pension scheme. So
Mm.
if you find in our country, if 80 more than 80% workers are uncovered, you find that the sum of those elderly who are not covered and those who are covered under social pensions, that has a correspondence, which means
Mm.
if 85% of people are not 85% of workers are not included in the scheme, say around 60% are totally excluded from 60% of elderly are totally excluded from any kind of pension benefit involving public expenditure.
Mm.
Another 20-23 odd percent would be getting some kind of a social pensions from
Mm.
the say National Social Assistance Program kind of thing, or in the states what they
Mm.
do. So if you see the sum of those who are uncovered elderly plus those who are under social pension, you will find a correspondence with 2-3 decades earlier of the non excluded workers.
Mm.
Unfortunately, in our country, you also find a contemporaneous correlation
Mm.
between the excluded workers or the proportion of excluded workers and the proportion of elderly who are uncovered or under social pensions.
Mm.
What that says is that over the last 3 decades, there has been no movement or no effort, maybe, or no attempt to actually try and include more and more workers into the system.
Mm. So it would not be wrong to say that, whatever we may make of our demographic bulge, there will be a bulge of unserviced elderly if we carry on
Right.
this way. And
Yes.
and the problem with this debate, what I realized after reading your paper was that there's so much focus on OPS and NPS that it totally forgets the fact that we have this massive problem that India has, where 80% of our workers do not have any pension system, and it will, as they grow old, become a social problem, because how else will we finance their expenditure. Now, coming to the end of of this thing, I have two questions. One is that India is, while we are the fifth largest economy and everything, we are still at a per capita level a poorer country. Government finances are limited. We run massive deficits just managing every year. How much of this problem can be solved by government? I'm trying to understand where the solutions may lie. So how much of this can be honestly solved by the government saying, okay, and I'm now talking beyond the OPS NPS thing, which is a separate, which is a small issue at one level. The larger issue of pension system in India, which is ranked very poorly. We wrote about this in a piece based on your working paper. It was ranked 41 out of 44 countries in the world. The larger issue of how to reform it. So what is the role of government? And then beyond government, what are the reforms that can be done? So if you could just reflect a bit on that.
To my mind, there is no other way but to first look more carefully at the old pension scheme, completely eliminate the beef there, completely eliminate there are a lot of components which are clearly a largesse. And that is what actually gets these people addicted to being in the public sector. And what the bureaucrats did when they introduced the new pension scheme was to actually safeguard their own benefits and only push it to the outsiders. So it was clearly an insider versus outsider kind of situation at that time. But the outsider that day is now an insider, and he or she is making noise. So there is no other goal to actually cap the public expenditure towards the pension system, but to reform first the old pension scheme. So the benefits have to be rationalized. I'm not saying cut. See, there are benefits. I don't know if you know of it. A couple of years, maybe 3-4 years ago, there was a demand from the defense to actually bring in BMWs to be sold from the canteen stores department.
Okay.
These are, by the way, retired defense personnel were demanding that.
Okay.
Why they are? Because to give you a simple calculation, the average pension, civilian pension in Tamil Nadu today is more than 3.5 lakhs. Average annual pension in Tamil Nadu is more than 3.5 lakhs. State personnel on average get a higher pension than in the federal government, and defense is much higher than average for the defense is much higher than that for the state governments also.
Okay.
Now, if you compare these numbers against the per capita GDP, you'll get a feel that the per capita GDP is somewhere around 1 lakh 140 or 1,000 rupees per annum. I'm not sure of the number, but somewhere around that.
Yeah.
So the per capita pension is from the public sector, from the government, is actually almost 2 to 3 or 4 times the average per capita GDP of the country. And this is perhaps an inefficient use of public resources or public funds, because the public funds have to be used in a manner which are equitable, which raise equity, or which have a distributive component in it. In the present design, this is not being served. Now, how do we go about actually reducing the largest in the old pension benefits, old pension scheme benefits? See, first, the deferred compensation is linked only to the peak salary. In the developed world, they have actually diluted that link. So the average for the best 5 years of service, or last 5 years of service, or best 25 years of service, or it can be the full service. So like I joined today, my salary is 100. You joined 10 years ago, your salary is 1,000. And when I retire, also, I should get a deferred compensation for today's contribution at 100 rupees. Tomorrow or day after's contribution should be measured at that rate. So we need to have a longer period. 10 months or the last month doesn't make a difference, because it's still the peak earning. That actually will give you also a hint why the service life at the top of the bureaucracy, whether it be civilians or in the defense, is much shorter, whether it be in the judiciary. It's because once you hit there, you know that you are getting a pension at the peak rate. So their lives are shorter, and then you actually keep serving each other. So, but that is something which I would say that can come later. To begin with, I think there are elements in the terminal benefits, which I talked of, which should be targeted first. See, in the terminal benefits, there are 3 components which I talked of. One is gratuity, which should not be touched because it is a good thing to do. But there is another leave, encashment of unavailed leaves and commutation of 40% of your future pension. See, why earned leaves were introduced has a history. Although India is not signatory to that UN convention, it was introduced. Earned leaves were introduced to bring in some kind of a work-life balance. Now, if you don't give leave or allow people to accumulate leaves and allow them to actually encash them at the end of life, it actually dilutes the objective for which it was brought in. Despite India not being a signatory to that convention, the bureaucracy in our country is happy to actually introduce what is good in the UN system for themselves. Although they may not be able to implement it for the rest of the workers, like Provident Fund will not be there for most of the workers, but for only a select few kind of. So these are things. So I would, and if you do away with the leave encashment part, and the second thing is disallow commutation of pension. See that also has a logic. See, as a worker, Udit, in your office, if you ask for advance salary, I'm sure you would be shown the door to say, see, there is nothing called an advance salary. A commutation of pension is similar. It is drawing an advance of your future pension benefit. So everyone is drawing that. Okay. Everyone takes it, and everyone does not need money everyone's need suddenly doesn't spot at the age of 60. So that is some benefit which I think is irrational. And it is when future or drawing an advance salary is disallowed, how can you allow a drawing an advance pension? And the travesty is that this is a very large component. It's almost if the two put together, commutation of pension and the leave encashment of earned leaves together constitute on an average more than 50% of all pension expenditure. And in some states, it can be much more than that, 25% or so. My sense is that this is undesirable. This is not rational. So these can be rationalized first before you start touching in the replacement rate of 50%. The ratcheting up of the replacement rate is also something which is not desirable. But I'm not talking of that now. I'm only concentrating on leave, disallowing leave encashment, disallowing restoration of pension, disallowing commutation of pension. Over a glide path of 5 years, this can be introduced for those who are actually going to retire today. So you can start thinking of it that 5 years down the line, you have you disallowed all. That would actually save you close to 300 billion rupees, which is more than sufficient. And I didn't want to arrive at such a number just like that. See, the reason was that I would like to now, there is an Atal Pension Yojana, which is to actually promote the voluntary participation of those in the unorganized sector to get on to this pension system. It provided for some kind of a limited period incentive of 1,000 rupees contribution by the federal government if you participate. I mean, if you contribute 1,000, the federal government will contribute an equivalent amount up to 1,000 rupees. My sense is that saving of 300 billion rupees, which I'm talking of, by disallowing the encashment of unavailed leave and the commutation of pension, can actually release funds by which you can include all the 20 to 39-year-old workers into an unrequited Atal Pension Yojana, where the government is making a contribution for them. Why I want to that kind? Why I want that? See, it is the individuals are open to make their contribution, but I know that the marginal propensity to save is very low, and particularly for a benefit which will come far in the future. So mandatorily, the government can actually do that by including all the 20 to 39-year-old workers into a Jan Dhan account kind of scheme, which will have an A and B component, where the B component relates to this Atal Pension Yojana, where the government is transferring 1,000 rupees per annum based on, you can use the Aadhaar base to actually link everyone. And this is possible. And purely by eliminating the two benefits which have very uh, evidence in the developed world. They just don't exist in the developed world. You can ask any of your friend in Singapore or anywhere, have you heard of leave encashment? They are actually encouraged to take leave. You can actually defer the leave at maximum of a week or so to the next year maybe, but there is nothing called encashment.
Okay.
And definitely not at the peak earning. Commutation is unheard of. It is the only country in the world which does this. Okay, so these are things, if you eliminate this largesse, you are releasing a massive amount of funds which actually can which actually can cover all the 20 to 39-year-old workers in the unorganized sector. And in 2 to 3 decades time, you will have covered the entire population. Because then it, and by the way, this saving is not 1 year, it is every year, because you were paying it every year. Because you were paying it every year, this is an every year saving.
Yeah.
Of course, after the first year of full introduction, it will not be apparent there, but it is a saving which you have now perpetually achieved. If you are able to do that, brings all the workers into the Atal Pension Yojana, you will also be able to manage to reduce the size of your social pension scheme to a minimum. Now everyone will have a respectable or a decent scheme to actually look forward to. Of course, you cannot stop with 1,000 rupees contribution per annum for the government. It will have to be raised periodically as years go by, with some form of inflation indexation. But to my mind, and also remember, your population rate is not going to increase. So the number of workers, new workers flowing in, is going to stabilize very soon. I would say that it is going to stabilize in less than 5 years' time. So this is doable. And once that is done, the social pension element actually reduces to a minimum, and you achieve the full coverage. So this is, to my mind, this is doable.
Okay, just to be very clear about this, you're saying that these benefits, when you say reform of this, you're saying the existing, my father, suppose he retired and he's getting all this. You're saying when you're saying reform means his benefits will be cut. Is that what you're saying? Or you're saying no? That part cannot be touched.
Those who have already got their commutation and avail of the leaves, you cannot touch them. Okay. I am saying that this is only for the, see, if you look at today's finance accounts or the budget, you will find that there is an element of leave encashment. Now that goes only to those who are fresh retirees, okay? And the commutation of pension also goes only towards those who are fresh retirees. On account of disallowing commutation of pension, the recurring pension component will go up, because 40% they were commutating. Now you are not disallowing, now you are disallowing that, so their recurring pension will go up. That also has been included in this calculation.
Okay.
So when you do that, and it's a simple thing, if you look at the aggregate numbers, you'll find that if you include the federal government civilian worker, civilian retirees, federal state government civilian retirees, and defense retirees, you will actually have a surplus.
Okay.
More than only 1,000 rupees will be more than adequate to be covered. You can actually go in for 1,500 rupees.
Okay. So, I want to bring this to a close because we're running out of time. But I want to just recap some of the very basic, salient, and very important bits that Professor Anand has mentioned. A, that the OPS NPS debate, it concerns very few people. Large swaths of India's workers are absolutely, they are bereft of any pension backup. So if you're watching us and if you're not part of the government, chances are you are without a decent pension backup. And we need to reform that. And what he said is that you can do it if you were to reform the OPS, the old pension scheme. If you were to tweak it and set it right, it might actually do two things. A, keep the disagreement within the new workers, the new government official workers working for the government, to a minimum. And secondly, it would release a lot of funds to take care of a lot of young people all through their old age. Release those funds for the government to provide for their pensions. So that is very important. And some of the points that he mentioned, that leave encashment or commutation of pension, these are things where massive savings can be made. Almost 50% of the outgo that the government has is on these issues. So there's much here to sort of think about, and that the issue is not so much a political slugfest, and it should not be seen as a binary of OPS and NPS, Congress and BJP. One must understand some of these issues, the math involved, and who all are involved. 85 to 80% of India's workers not having any pension protection. So the issues are more complicated, and I hope all of you got some understanding about the issues involved. I would like to again thank Professor Anand for sparing the time so generously and explaining to us all the issues. Thank you. And to the readers and to the viewers and readers, if you like the show, please press like and subscribe to our channel, and we'll be back next week. Thank you.